welcome everyone to the second virtual override informational meeting. I am Liz Spinney, the chair of the Yes Grafton Committee, and I think I speak for myself and the rest of our committee when we say that we're very happy to have all of you here tonight. At the last meeting, I didn't introduce myself, so I thought I would do that a little bit tonight. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm actually not a member of any town committee, but I have served for the past 3 years as president of North Grafton PTG. I'm also on the board of Apple Tree Arts and have been doing that for several years. And I'm also a volunteer this year for the Grafton Farmers Market Committee. That's been fun. I began my career as an engineer. I graduated from Ohio State University. I grew up in Ohio. And in 2003, I received my Juris Doctorate from Notre Dame. I've been practicing law for 17 years. I've served as, I used to work in a law firm, and then I was assistant general counsel for several small oncology pharmaceutical companies for a few years. And then 3 years ago, I began performing the same work as a solo practitioner for several small pharmas. So that's what I do. I also have 3 kids. Next year, I'll have one in each of the main schools. I'll have a student in high school, one in middle school, and one in elementary school. So that's me. This forum tonight that I'm all happy to have you here is designed to replace the kind of meet and greet gatherings that people used to be able to have in their homes for these types of questions. So I ask you tonight to act with the same kind of civility and decorum, and I'm sure you will, that you might if you were a guest tonight in my home. And so just so everyone knows, this is not a municipal event. It's a public event put on by a registered ballot question committee, Yes Grafton. We are going to try to keep this to an hour tonight because I know people want to spend the evening with their families. So the plan is to start with the presentations, and then after all the presentations are complete, we're going to proceed to a Q&A session. So we do encourage people to ask questions, so please take notes while you're hearing the information so that you can answer ask your questions at the end. Just so you know, I'm also going to reserve the right to limit the length of any back and forth that we might have tonight, just so we can make sure we hear from as many people as possible. And just to let people know, this is being recorded tonight. If you attended this presentation on Sunday as well, you'll notice that some of the information is the same, although we did try to add some information based on some questions that we received so that we can hopefully provide the most thorough presentation that we can provide in an hour's time. Okay? So this virtual informational meeting is designed to provide Grafton voters with information to help them make a decision easier at the polls or in your absentee ballot on or before June 23rd. On election day that's set so far. We know that there may be a couple people watching tonight who may not be in favor of this override at present, and we hope that we can persuade you to change your mind. But we welcome you and we thank you for keeping an open mind tonight. This is not, however, a debate as to whether or not the override should be on the ballot. The select board already unanimously voted in March that it should be. So instead, the question that I put to you all tonight is, will you vote to allow the town to increase our taxes just enough to provide necessary funding to maintain the services of our schools and provide for upcoming public safety needs? It's our hope that after hearing the information tonight, if not at least by voting day, June 23rd, that your answer to that question will be yes. And with that, I want to present a couple of slides for you. The agenda for tonight, we already started around 7 with a welcome and introduction by me, Liz Spinney. We'll hear in a few minutes from our guest speaker, Jay Cummings, the Grafton Public Schools Superintendent. We will also hear from Peter Carlson, who will talk about the needs of the fire department. And we'll have a Q&A session starting at approximately 7:35. Hopefully we'll get to that. And then we'll end the evening with some final remarks around 7:55. So first, for those who need to hear this, what is Proposition 2.5? So in Massachusetts, towns are allowed every year to increase their property taxes to keep up with inflation. So because that's going to happen every year and they need to be able to account for that. In 1980, the Massachusetts state legislature voted to put a cap on that so that towns can't increase the taxes more than 2.5% each year without putting it to a vote to the citizens. So this is referred to now as Proposition 2.5. So the override would allow the town to override that Proposition 2.5 to collect an additional $4 million from Grafton taxpayers through real estate property taxes. This is expected to provide enough to make up for the funding gap that we've seen for schools, for fire department, and for some of the needed capital repairs and improvements on the long list of those items. Like I mentioned, our taxes in Grafton and everywhere go up every year to keep up with inflation. So with this override, they would go up just a little bit more to cover these expenses. Now, just to give people an idea of what to expect, of what they might see as a difference on their tax bill. For the average Grafton household, this would amount to an annual additional increase of approximately $10 per month if you spread the annual increase out over the month. So if you have to save for your taxes month to month, this is what you might see. And that's assuming a 5-year period. So some people might pay a little less, some people might pay a little more. This is the average Grafton household, which is based on a average home value in Grafton of $419,000. So depending on where you fall in that range, you might see a little more, a little less. This is going to vary year to year because some years the town will vote to use a little bit more of the override allocation, some years a little less. So this is what we're providing tonight to try to give you an idea of what that number is going to look like. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Cummings, who's going to talk about the need and the impact on Grafton Public Schools. So thank you, Dr. Cummings.
Right. Thank you very much, Liz. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jay Cummings. I'm the Superintendent of Schools. I'll start with a quick coronavirus disclaimer. Our current reality is obviously filled with unknowns right now. We don't know when schools will reopen to in-person teaching or what things are going to look like next year. We don't know what the financial impact's going to be, but we can assume that school funding will decrease and the need for additional services and monies is going to increase. So tonight, for the purpose of this brief presentation, I'm going to focus on what we do know. Yet it's important to realize that the funding gaps that I'll be discussing will most likely be magnified due to the situation at hand. So again, thank you for your interest in the Grafton Public Schools. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to run through about 15 slides and provide a summary of the long-term budget problem that we're facing. I'll define the problem, discuss the current return on investment that the schools provide the town, and then illustrate how the projected funding will not allow us to maintain what we currently provide. We're faced with a fundamental problem. On one hand, we want to keep what we currently have. We've got a high-quality school system defined by great students and staff, positive and student-centered climate, strong scores, diverse programming, wide array of activities for all levels. We've managed to maintain all of this while having one of the lowest funding levels in the state. This desire to want, at the very least, to keep what we have currently is being threatened by reduced funding. While the town has generously supported the schools, we're faced with inadequate town funding. That inadequate funding is paired with the fact that Grafton is a minimal aid district. Therefore, we receive the minimum amount of state funding annually. I'm going to spend a couple slides looking at per pupil rates. Per pupil rates are used by school districts to provide an apple-to-apple comparison of school spending. Per pupil rates simply take all of the money spent on education in a school district and divides that figure by the number of students in that district. You can see that Grafton, here in blue on the bottom, is significantly below area districts. To me, that means we've done an exceptional job in creating a strong educational system with one of the very lowest amounts of funding in the state. This return on investment that we get here in Grafton is unquestionably among the very best in Massachusetts. This is another way of illustrating the difference in per pupil spending. It's important to understand that what looks like a small difference in the chart equates to massive amounts of funding. Shrewsbury is the second lowest in per pupil spending, as you can see. But the small difference in the bar chart does a disservice to the vast difference in funding. If Shrewsbury's per pupil funding was applied to Grafton, we'd have an additional $3.2 million annually to spend on our educational system. It's important to keep in mind that Shrewsbury is well below the state average. If we had the state average per pupil amount, we'd be spending over $12 million more annually. My point is that we spend less than 97% of school districts and still manage to get strong results. We can't maintain this with reduced funding in the future. The great majority of monies that school districts have access to are derived from local funding and state funding. We'll discuss local funding first. In the spring of 2014, the Grafton taxpayers generously passed an override that was designed in part to keep the schools whole for 5 years. Through a strong fiscal approach, we've stretched these funds to largely remain whole for the past 6 years. Almost every town in the state provides for more monies than the state mandates for education. The bar for required spending is considered really low across Massachusetts. Grafton spends approximately 15% more on education than is mandated by the state, yet you can see that Grafton trails area districts in local spending. The districts that we are ahead of in the area, Oxford and Northbridge, receive almost twice as much state funding as Grafton does. So in total, they have significantly greater educational funding than we do. Now we'll take a look at state funding. Grafton is considered a minimal aid district. Basically, the state looks at Grafton as a community that could spend more on education, and therefore we receive $30 per student in additional monies each year. This totals a little over $90,000 for us. You may have heard about the new Student Opportunity Act, through which the state is infusing about $1.5 billion to districts across the state through FY27. While we had hopes of benefiting from this act, you can see that we don't see a single dime until FY22. And even then, an additional $26,000 doesn't move the needle much for us economically. In total, we expect to see a little over $600,000 in additional funding through FY27. Hopefully, I've made it clear that we have comparatively low local funding and the very lowest level of state funding. This is not a good combination for any district. I've given you a brief overview of local and state funding. Local and state funding together make up almost all of the school department budget. We work to maximize that local and state funding by being as efficient as we possibly can be. We also generate revenue by charging monies for transportation fees and will be instituting athletic fees next year. We also have a fully developed school choice program that generates revenue that pays for staff and other expenses. We have also maxed out our use of solar and have invested in specialized programming for students with special needs, which is great not only for the students, but it's also a great cost-saving investment for the town. This slide illustrates the school district's funding levels since FY13. You'll see those in blue. And in the green, you can see our projected needs for FY21 through FY27. The anticipated needs that we're projecting are designed to maintain what we currently provide now. This does not include any new programs or initiatives. Basically, what we have laid out is what we need to maintain the current return on investment for the town. While our projected needs are being maintained, the problem comes from anticipated funding taking a significant and ongoing hit in future years. That red line going across the chart represents an increase of 5.25%. You may remember this from the override in FY15, so the spring of 14. That 5.25 was our benchmark for funding needed to not only maintain services, but to grow and expand programming. Again, for the purposes of this override, we are aspiring to maintain only. When we look at projected funding for the schools, you can see in yellow that we anticipate being funded at an unprecedented low level for the foreseeable future. Each bar represents the percentage increase that is forecasted. When I fill in the gap between the projected needs and the projected funding, you can clearly see in red that we're going to have an ongoing budgetary gap to contend with. There's simply no way that we can face this ongoing gap without either additional funding or absorbing a significant reduction in services that we currently provide. The bar charts that I just showed are boiled down here to actual numbers. The numbers in red are the anticipated deficits that we're going to face annually through FY27. We expect to be $3.3 million short of what is needed through FY25. As I stated earlier, we can either secure additional funding or reduce. If we have to reduce, this slide shows how much we'll need to cut each year. Part of my job as superintendent is to plan out what we can directly control. In this situation, we're forced to create a plan for making reductions that will allow us to be as functional as possible with dysfunctional funding. Districts faced with one-year short-term budget gaps can typically take action to weather a short-term storm without significantly impacting the school district in a way that impacts students. Districts that are faced with multi-year reductions simply cannot prevent eventual district failure. To cover a multi-million-dollar funding gap that has no end in sight, districts have to reduce in two areas: personnel and non-personnel. School districts are typically made up of about 80% personnel costs and 20% non-personnel. This holds true for Grafton. Many people think we can simply use less paper and pencils. And while we're going to have to plan to reduce both, there's no scenario in which non-personnel reductions close the gap that we're facing. In the end, 80% or more of the reductions we make will be in the area of personnel, and that will have a direct impact on the services we provide students. This is a reduction plan that I put before the school committee a couple months back. It's not designed to be alarmist or scary, but it definitely is. There's no way to fill a $3 million budget gap in a district that's already in the bottom 3% in funding in Massachusetts without it being devastating to the school district. Unfortunately, what I've laid out follows a predictable pattern for those districts that are dismantled. In a very general sense, we will have to increase class sizes over 30. We'll have to eliminate the majority of athletics. We'll have to decrease student supports and then eliminate any programming that is not mandated: art, music, technology, etc. A local example of this can be seen in Northbridge, as they've had to reduce in a similar way over the past decade. The reduction plan that I showed in the previous slide was based on the anticipated budget gap. What we've not taken into account are the compounding issues that are paired with the school district becoming dysfunctional. When a district falls apart, two additional things happen. School choice funding disappears and the special education costs increase. Currently, we have just over 100 students participate in our school choice program. This generates over $500,000 a year that helps us with salaries and other costs. There's a tremendous demand and desire for this program in Grafton. When a district falls apart, school choice students no longer want to attend the district because we'd have equally, if not higher, class sizes than their home district, and that revenue disappears, leaving a greater gap. As I mentioned earlier, we've worked hard to build strong special education programs in the district. Currently, we have one of the very lowest percentage of students with special needs who attend specialized schools out of district. That's both great for students to be able to stay in town, and it's great for the town financially. Once class sizes increase dramatically and supports are stripped away, out-of-district placements increase and the funding gap is further magnified. While we have one of the lowest percentages of out-of-district placements in Massachusetts, it's not a coincidence that Northbridge currently has one of the very highest. So here we are, we're faced with the fundamental problem of inadequate funding. The schools have not overspent, and the town has consistently been very supportive of our schools. Yet our community is faced with the reality that we cannot continue to function as we have with further reductions. The state is clearly not going to address our needs, and that leaves local funding as the one hope that we have. I'm incredibly proud of the fact that the Grafton Public Schools have managed to provide an excellent level of service with very limited funding. I can say with 100% certainty that this underdog performance will not continue with further reductions to the school budget. As your superintendent, fellow town resident, and taxpayer, I hope that everyone considers the continued investment in a town department that I believe has consistently outperformed and delivered for Grafton. And that's what I have for you tonight. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Cummings. Wonderful presentation, a lot of information. I really appreciate that. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just wanted to add a little personal commentary, if I may. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. It happened to be exactly the same size as Grafton. And our schools at the time I was in school had several failed overrides. What I experienced as a result is actually one of the main reasons I live here in Massachusetts, where I think the schools are amazing. So I kind of find it ironic that I find myself in the same situation trying to get an override passed 25 years later. But in the schools I grew up in, we paid for busing, we paid for sports. We had very few extracurriculars. We had no theater program, barely any arts programs, one language, no real science labs because we couldn't afford the equipment. Our books were outdated, the roofs were leaky and often caving in. And it wasn't always that way. That's just the picture of the school that I was attending at the time when we were in that situation where time after time we were not able to pass overrides. I graduated salutatorian in my class. I went to college. I was in the honors program. But what happened was I was pretty humiliated going into college. I was studying engineering, and this is just one story, but one of my first chemistry classes, I'll never forget, we were supposed to take an inventory of our lab drawer. And I didn't know what anything was because we didn't have enough money for labs. I remember having one lab and I didn't know what a Bunsen burner was. I had to ask my students sitting next to me what things were, and they thought I was kind of pathetic. But I'll never forget that feeling. It was awful. So I worked, I ended up okay, but from what I saw later, I felt like I was an exception. We had a class of 100. 5 people at my 5-year reunion had actually graduated from college. And, I know not everyone's planning to go to college. That's not the life for them, but that's one number that I happen to have. So whether they went to college or not, it wasn't a good situation. And I never want my kids or any of the kids in our school system who I care about very much to experience a failed school system like I did. Just some food for thought. And so next I want to introduce Peter Carlson, who was a member of the Fire Study Committee, and he's going to talk about our public safety needs. So Peter.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here for one moment. Make sure I don't break the internet. Okay, everything look good on everyone's in there? You can see the slide? Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your time tonight. Just a brief introduction. My name is Peter Carlson. Just for transparency purposes, I am a sitting member of the Grafton Select Board, and I also sit on the Fire Study Committee. And what I'm going to be talking here tonight is about just some of the public safety needs that if this override were to pass, that would help assist with the town of Grafton in maintaining and assisting our fire department. Again, just real quick, I want to make sure everyone's aware that I speak for myself. I do not speak on behalf of the Select Board or the Grafton Fire Study Committee today. And with that, I wanted to kind of go into and kind of give you like the current reality of what we're dealing with this year's budget. And that is every year we seem to be moving more and more things out of the municipal line items and the expense columns and moving them over into what we call separate warrant articles to be funded by one-time monies. This is typically free cash that's left over from the previous years. And although this is a method in order to fund these articles, I just want to let you know that it's growing on an annual basis. So last year and in subsequent years before that, we have removed police cruisers completely out of the budget and put them into their own line item. So you're probably wondering, like, what's wrong with that? Well, police cruisers are an essential part of the police response. And with those cruisers, those are what you consider an expense item that they get replaced every 3 years. Those vehicles get used constantly, and they need to be maintained in an always ready state. This year, we did not include them into the police department budget. So it shows that we've decreased the municipal budget by the requested amount for the cruisers, and then we moved them over to a separate warrant article to pay for them out of other funds. In addition to that, with the police cruisers, was that police radios. Again, something else that is typically considered an expense item for a police department, because communication being the key component for any functioning police department or public safety department for that matter, was also handled the same way, where in order to reduce the line items in the expenses for the municipal side of the budget for police department, they moved those two into a separate warrant article to be funded by none other than free cash. One of the things that's alarming is that the equipment budget for firefighting life-saving equipment, like personal protection equipment, et cetera, and so on and so forth, the other materials at the fire department, which typically used to have it in its expense column, very similar to what the police department had, has also been moved out and then put into a separate warrant article. These things are somewhat alarming and kind of raise a yellow flag, because if we can't have enough, we can't raise enough appropriate taxes to pay for those essential items which are considered expenses, this runs the risk of a couple things. Eventually, if we run out of free cash, then how do we fund these things going forward without making other serious cuts? And I think that from a transparency perspective, I just kind of want to, give you the just the top 3 things that I think you would see at this town meeting when we have it. So one of the things I want to focus on that this override would give us is that if it passes, that this our Grafton Fire Department is a call fire department. It is not a volunteer. So basically what that means is that the department, when it responds to a call, is based on a part-time when needed. So if the fire department was to respond to an event on the Mass Pike, or if they were to respond to in front of Dunkin' Donuts because of a car accident, or to a structure fire, those that staff of the department, those firefighters and first responders, are paid on an hourly basis to make that response to that fire department. So with the exception of all the firefighters being part-time, the only real full-time person who works for the fire department is an administrative assistant. Now, given that Grafton has seen its population grow steadily over the years, so you can imagine that our public safety needs from what they were 20, 25 years ago to what they are today are drastically changing. The amount of calls, the amount of administrative overhead, all of these things that are necessary in running a functioning fire department are absolutely crucial. So just to kind of give you a glimpse, the numbers that I have here, and I could probably get some updated ones for the next one, but from 2014 to 2017, the fire department was responding to an annual average of 544 incidents per year. So you can imagine that several times per week, one of the stations was responding, 1 or 2 or 3, or maybe an all-station call was responding to some sort of event that required firefighters and first responders. So what's going on? Well, right now, the fire department leadership has many experienced firefighters that are close to retirement. So essentially what this means is that our call fire department is aging out soon. And basically, there's a state law that says that at age 65, you can no longer serve as an active member on any fire department, for that matter. So just to kind of show you that in the upper echelons of where the leadership is, we just had an Assistant Chief Barker who just retired in February. In addition to that, Assistant Chief Steve Charis retired just, I think, last year or a little bit longer than that, 18 months ago. And that our part-time chief, Michael Gauthier, is actually retiring in less than 2 years because they will all be aging out. So as you can imagine, that this is leading to a skills gap in that leadership positions that Grafton needs to address today. Now, we can't wait until Chief Gauthier retires and then decide, hey, do we need to hire a full-time fire chief? So with that, the Grafton Select Board authorized a fire department report that called for transitioning the Grafton Fire Department to really kind of like that more appropriate structure to mature its essential capabilities. So basically what it did was it looked at the, it's really just kind of a giant SWOT analysis where they looked at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and essentially said that because you have a lot of the aging firefighters that are going to be retiring soon, that replacing them should be a top priority. In addition to that, transitioning our department from part-time management to full-time management. So imagine if Grafton Police Department had a part-time police chief, okay? So that is essentially what this report has said, that that's something that really can't exist anymore. Whereas for many, many years prior to this, it was adequate for Grafton when we were, at less than 8,000 residents in a much rural community, farm community. So as the times have caught up with us, the report calls for a restructuring and additional investment into moving that part-time fire chief into a full-time position, but it also called for other positions in order to maintain the safety and well-being of our firefighters, but more importantly, being able to respond to modern-day public incidences that are evolving. So give it and take, right now we have the COVID-19. Training and preparedness for the department to handle those types of situations is really what this report called for. You can see this report. It is on the town's webpage. I'll show it here shortly that you can download it and read it yourself, but I won't, for the sake of time, I'm gonna just kind of skip over real quick and talk about what the positions will be funded with this override. So you heard me talk about this real quick, that the cost of these positions that Grafton needs to make sure it has allocated is going to cost about $400,000 a year. What this will do is this will provide those a reliable response and leadership team and be able to give support in maintaining a call fire department. So it's very important to know that in the MR report, it doesn't say for the whole department to go full time. What it's talking about is that its leadership at that level needs to be there at a consistent basis, 40 hours a week, being able to be full-time in order to maintain an on-call structured fire department. So the report called for maintaining call firefighters, but to have full-time leadership position. So essentially what they call for is basically a shift from part-time to full-time chief, adding a part-time assistant deputy chief to making a full-time call assistant chief. They talk about fire safety and training officer, and this is very important because it talks about maintaining safety levels and requirements for having a properly functioning fire department. So if you take into consideration the events that happened in Worcester lately and so on and so forth, where they're going over and reviewing their needs due to the unfortunate loss of first responders, this is something that personally is near and dear to my heart, and that I would want our call fire department to be able to have these resources and have someone who's watching out and maintaining their training regime. And last but not least, but is the full-time fire inspector. So what this person does here is, if any of you had sold or bought a home in Grafton, you most likely had to see that there was a fire inspection done, which they look at the smoke detectors and make sure that your house is up to code. But in addition to this, the full-time fire inspector also annually inspects all municipal buildings to assure that they are safe for not only our staff to work there, make sure that they're being maintained from a fire protection standpoint, but also for the general public to make use of those buildings. In particular, I can tell you that the school department goes through this on an annual basis prior to students returning from summer recess. So real quick, I just want to kind of give you a glimpse here. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just some surrounding towns. These were these towns were actually picked based on comparable population, what their budget looks like, and what their per capita income is. So as you can see from Amesbury to Bellingham, you can see that there's 3.4 million to 2.7 million annually for their fire department budgets. Grafton is at $603,000. As you can see, Holden, which is not a town on the other side of Worcester County, is at 1.1 million. Norton's at 3.7 million. Pembroke, 3.3 million. Rockland, 3.4. Somerset, 2.1, and Winthrop, 2.8. As you can see, with our department being at $603,000, we are really the only department out of any one of those towns that I read that has a part-time assistant chief, a part-time fire chief, and really no dedicated part-time safety chief. So I just wanted to clear up that Grafton has a very dedicated. They are dedicated to responding and serving Grafton. I just want to say a personal thanks to them and their service to this town over the years and for the upcoming future years. And with that, Liz, I am all done. Thank you. You're on mute, Liz. Liz, you're on mute.
Thank you, Peter. Sorry. In a minute, we're going to give you some information. If you would like to help us advocate for the override, we're going to tell you how you might do that. But right now, we're going to proceed to the Q&A portion of this meeting. So if you have any questions, if you're on video, you can raise your hand. You can also send us a question through the Q&A. The only thing that I ask is, because we're trying to maintain sort of a nice community feel to this event, that if you can identify yourself in the question when you ask it, if you don't mind. And we'll tell you, if we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible. If we don't get to everyone tonight, I'll tell you at the end of the meeting how you can still get your question answered. So with that, I just open up the floor, and a couple other of my committee members are going to help me make sure I see everybody. We have a lot of people here tonight, so we'll have to flip through screens to see if people have their hands up. So just bear with us, and we'll try to get to everyone we can. If you don't have, if you don't have a question personally, but you have a question that you think a lot of people are asking, and maybe they would like to hear an answer to tonight, or anything that you'd like us to expand upon from our presentation. Like we said, this is being recorded, and we're going to try to provide more information to people who couldn't make it tonight later. So that would be helpful to other people as well. So we'll give people one more minute or so to see if they have any questions. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Is anyone else on the committee seeing any that I'm missing or anything? I want to make sure I don't miss anybody. Okay, I guess I'll proceed to the rest of the presentation then. Give me 1 second to share my screen again. Okay. So of course it always starts over on me. Let me breeze through. You've already seen all of this. Okay, so Q&A. So how can you help? There are so many ways that you can help. First of all, of course, the most important way is to vote yes on June 23rd. We also have a Facebook page. If you like and follow our page, you'll get updates and more information throughout this election period. Talk to your friends. I know you may not be seeing your friends in the usual ways But if you have, Zoom meetings like this, virtual gatherings, or if you see people from a distance as you're walking the dog or something like that, however you're talking to people in town these days, talk to them, let them know that this is something that you're concerned about and that this is coming up. Some people might not even know that this is up for election. So let them know what this is all about, and tell them what you know about it and why this is important to you. We also have a survey for information that's also on our Facebook page. We'd love to, if you didn't feel like saying anything tonight, we'd still love to hear from you. There's a space in there for you to give some feedback. We're also taking donations. There's there's costs involved with trying to get the word out about this, signs and things like that. So we have a Venmo account. It's at Yes Grafton. We love your support in that way as well. I know it's a hard time, but every little bit matters. So thank you for considering that as well. Send emails to people. Share posts that you see on Facebook. If you see us post something that you think is particularly helpful, something that's useful that other people will find helpful as well, share it on your personal page, because you have connections that many of us don't. So that would be very helpful. We want to reach out to as many people as we can. And eventually we hope to be able to put out signs closer to time of election. So we'd love to be able to get a sign in your yard. If you're welcome to that, you can sign up to do that through that survey on our Facebook page, and we'll make sure that that's easily visible to everyone on our Facebook page throughout this term as well. So we'd love to have your help. We know this is a challenging time to have an override on the ballot, but I don't think any of us are just doing this because it's fun. We're doing it because it's important, and we need you. We need as many people as we can to help in this effort, and it is very important. So I'm going to pause one more minute. Any other I haven't seen any questions come up. Just checking one more time.
Yeah, there actually was one question. I had missed a hand. I'm going to unmute her now.
Okay,
If she
great.
wants to. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Okay, hi. I'm Marilyn Kusher at 3 Lincoln Lane. One of the things, I support the override, but one of the things that I keep hearing is that we cannot stay within a budget. Why do we constantly need more money? And I know we haven't done this for a number of years, but could you just explain for people who may not understand why do we need the override? Why can't we stay within this 2% budget?
Who would like to answer that?
Liz, I could take a stab at that.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that. It's a great question, Marilyn. And again, thank you for attending tonight. The reason why we did the override in 2014 is because Grafton has come at a crossroads where we had decreased state funding, and our expenses just at level services were far exceeding what our local tax rate in Grafton could support. The same thing has happened again. So this has been a message from some of us since 2014 when that first one passed, that this eventually is going to come down again, and that in order to prevent this from occurring again, there needs to be some extreme diversification in our tax base. And what I mean by that is we are over a 90% residential tax base. So basically what that means is homeowners pretty much foot the bill for Grafton, while the remaining components are made up of businesses and commercial interests in Grafton. Whereas if you go to our neighboring town, Westboro, and I know we shouldn't compare because it's apples and oranges, they're like 50% commercial or over and 50% residential. So they are able to have a larger tax base that helps offset the cost for those existing inhabitants in Westboro. So what ends up happening is that as we try to level service our needs, We realize that Grafton can only, under the guise of Massachusetts Proposition 2.5, can only raise and appropriate taxes so much without going back to the town and saying, town, we understand that this is the cap in which we can raise. We have to go to the town and ask its permission and get its support through a ballot initiative, not through town meeting, to get its support to tax over that amount for whatever appropriate needs that future town meetings may agree upon. So I hope I'm able to answer that question. I think there's a lot more to that. I'm trying to keep it as concise as possible. And if anyone else wants to add some commentary to that or would like to address it, by all means. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing to that. I was doing some research today about overrides across the Commonwealth, and I found this is, and I sort of knew this, but I wanted to get some more data on it. This is not such an unusual thing for a town to have to go through. And there are, most of the towns in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have had to put an override to the voters at one point or another. In fact, from the research that I did, there were many towns that had over 25 or more overrides during the course of the 40 years since Proposition 2.5, because this 2.5 increase every year just for many, many towns just is not enough to keep up with inflation, to keep up with the rising costs. So it's not necessarily a problem that was caused by anything other than just the 2.5 increase is difficult to maintain.
Thank you. That's what I thought.
Okay. Anyone see any other questions before I move on? I'm not seeing any.
I actually have one question. Sorry. This is Laura Deneen.
Okay.
Just briefly to kind of expand on that. How do we know, based upon what we're seeing now in town, in 5 years or so, we're not going to be asked as homeowners for another override? I know, a pat answer is, well, we're not sure, but I'm just curious as to what thought has been put into what thought has been put into that, et cetera, that the homeowners won't be asked again in 5 or 6 years for another override.
Anyone want to take that before I jump in?
Hey, Liz, I have no problem taking that again. Laura, hi. Thanks for making it out tonight. That's also another great question. It's the same question we asked back in 2014. The simple answer to that is what I was talking about earlier, is aggressively seeking other means to diversify our tax base. Now, the reality of that occurring in the next 5 years is unknown. We're in some really kind of uncharted territories right now. I think everyone can agree. But in order to offset just the natural rising of costs for the town to be able to keep up with just the level services, that's what would have to happen. In addition to that, other state aid would have to miraculously kick in. And as you are well aware, if you've been following the news over the past year, the Commonwealth passed its really groundbreaking, sweeping changes in Chapter 70, and Grafton really isn't going to benefit from that at all. Or I should say it will benefit from it, but not until 2024, 2025 and beyond, where they'll kick in some additional monies beyond that additional per pupil raise that we usually get, anywhere from $25 to $30 per student per year. What prevents us from asking that question again? Having really good fiscal controls, having really good modeling going forward, being able to be transparent with the community. I believe that saying that, we're in great financial shape is probably not an ideal thing to say when you know that your rate of spend just to maintain level services will far exceed your rate of income in the future. So I think having the modeling and having the information available for voters and citizens of Grafton, I think is crucial to that. So that way, when we're making future decisions and when we're seeing zoning changes or we're seeing other opportunities for us to really increase our opportunities for economic development, that the town sees why those changes would be necessary. So I kind of answered your question a little bit, but like I said, I can't answer what will happen in 5 years, but in order to prevent asking again, I believe those are just some of the changes that we need to see in Grafton.
Liz, can I hop in a little bit?
Absolutely.
So a couple of other things that we definitely could do. So Peter's talked a lot about kind of the revenue side of things and increasing our, commercial taxes that are coming in, managing our, the development of the town and all that. That's all important. The unfortunate thing about commercial development, particularly in Grafton, is that it's a really multi-year, long-term grind trying to bring additional business into Grafton. There's lots of property on Route 9 and Route 20 and other towns that's much more accessible, that has higher traffic counts, and that just is a more natural fit in terms of economic development. Grafton has a particularly challenging type of environment to actually bring businesses in that are going to move, like significantly move the dial economically for us, and to bring in enough revenue to really provide some relief. But there are some things that we certainly can do and we should be doing. I've long been a big advocate of capital planning, forecasting, and long-term planning, by looking ahead into the future and actually trying to make decisions from a long-term basis rather than kind of reacting to things, reactively, I guess. We can make things cheaper over time. Capital is a good example of that. If we're doing more preventative, regular scheduled maintenance on our capital assets to maintain them, that's cheaper over time than sort of what we're doing right now, is we're kicking things down the road a little bit to try to save a little bit of money. If we're more proactive and more forward thinking in terms of that type of need with maintaining our capital assets over time, we can make it cheaper over time. This override is a good example. You'll find that all of these needs that we have, things like the police cars, we're on a rotation, and the fire equipment is another thing where we're on this rotation of equipment that we have to provide up-to-date, up-to-spec equipment for our public safety officers to have. Those needs don't go away. That's the reason that they're in the operational budget right now. If we don't do this override, that need now doubles for next year because we need that equipment every single year. So the further we put this off, the bigger the override becomes. So that's another example of we sort of need to address this need now rather than having a bigger price tag with a bigger sense of sticker shock later on. And I think the last thing is that we need to be really honestly talking as a town about what our situation is. And Peter talked kind of around it. We have a structural deficit. That just means that, the arc of the income is crossing paths with the arc of the costs over time. So this is something that's structural. It's something that we need to be more forward thinking about, and we need to do things in a different way to try to prevent this from happening in the future. But as a town, we need to be very open about our situation, and we need to be very open with citizens and voters about what we're doing to try to improve this and change things. But when it comes time to have an override, that we all feel comfortable that everything that can be done has been done. And so I've been to a bunch of finance committee conferences, and the model that I like to hold out there is Arlington. They're just unapologetic about it. They bring their expertise in from their boards and committees. They have lots and lots of public outreach. They have long town meetings with lots of public involvement. People beg to, they have to campaign to be on their town committee, their town meeting committee, to represent their neighborhoods and whatnot. And there's just a very robust way to include people in all of the discussions and in all of the decisions, so that they feel like everything that they can, you know, have a voice in, they have a voice in, and that everything possible has been done. So I think part of it is just public education, bringing people in to help them understand what's happening and making them understand that there is a lot being done, because there is. I mean, if we talk about that, you know, the commercial development piece, there's a ton of stuff that's going in the planning board and EDC with our economic development coordinator, our town administrator, everybody, they're all trying to find that additional revenue. It's really challenging though. So, but you know, just all of that is to say that a lot is happening. I think we just need to have a better message out to the town about all of those things that are happening, you know, on both the expense and the revenue side of things.
All right, thank you, Matt. Okay, so I think we're gonna start wrapping things up here tonight. Again, thank you to everyone for coming. Bring my screen over here 1 second. So I just wanted to give you a few, keep pressing the button, a few key takeaways for tonight. Just go through this real quick. So as we mentioned, Proposition 2.5 limits the tax increases without a vote. That's why we need to have this override vote in June. For towns across the Commonwealth, this 2.5 year after year is often just not enough to keep up with rising costs, and that's where we find ourselves in Grafton. School spending, as we've seen, is as lean as it can get. So much has been done to make sure that that's the case. School revenue options have been implemented. You heard a lot of those tonight. They've done everything they can. The state increases for Grafton schools is just not keeping up with the increased need, as we've seen. So our schools need more local tax revenue. That's the only other place that we can get it at this point. And then we also saw the fire department has reached its limits and needs that extra tax revenue as well to keep up with its upcoming needs. We may be hit even harder, as we've seen. We don't know what's going to happen in the coming years. So there's possibilities that we could be hit even harder due to COVID-19. Hopefully not, but it's a real possibility. And so if we don't agree to an override this year, next year could be even more expensive because you saw some of the compounding effects of not agreeing to this year. So with all the information that we presented tonight, we hope that you will vote yes on June 23rd. Absentee ballots can be requested on the town website. We want to make sure everyone is aware of that. If you haven't heard, the restrictions regarding the requirements for getting an absentee ballot have been changed this year, so that you can get an absentee ballot just based on the fact that you are trying to social distance and maintain that this year. So if you're worried at all about that, please reach out and request that absentee ballot. And if you didn't get it, if you think of a question later, or you didn't for some reason get to answer or ask your question tonight, please feel free to email us. It's at yesgrafton@gmail.com, and we'd love to try to answer your question some other time. Other than that, I thank everyone for coming here tonight. Good to see you all, or a lot of you, or see your names up there. I thank you for attending, and thank you for participating in this event tonight. And I hope you will vote yes June 23rd. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to our speakers as well. Dr. Cummings, Peter Carlson, thank you for giving us the information tonight.
Thank you for the invitation, Liz. Have a good night.
Thank you for hosting.
Good night, everyone. Stay safe.